Hi everyone, this is the first of the introductory Photoshop tutorials. In this section we're going to talk about the interface, some of the basic commands, and how you navigate around in Photoshop. As mentioned in the previous Illustrator tutorial, Photoshop is a raster editing program, which means that it works with image content like pictures and photographs and those sorts of things. We use this type of program when we're working with raw images, if you're taking a photograph of something or working with a photograph from online. And we also use it to build renderings and other types of graphic information that we will be editing kind of in different ways. So that'll become more clear if you're not familiar with Photoshop as we move through the tutorials. So basically, Photoshop should look a little bit familiar. The interface should look a little bit familiar since we've already been through the Illustrator tutorials. They're all Adobe programs and they tend to have the same basic functionality to them. So we have a window, we have a tool palette over here on the left, and we have a series of panels on the right. Again, panels, you control the visibility of them under the window icon, or the window drop down, sorry. And so when you can choose different windows that will display the properties for that topic. So if I want the color palette to be open, I can make sure that it's on here, and I can also click back and forth between ones that are embedded within each other. The same as in Illustrator is true. You can pull tabs out of the sidebar and collapse them, so I can make swatches go away, and I can also, if I want to, open a swatch or open a new tab and then dock it into one of the existing panels or between the existing panels. And you can reorganize the location of things. Also, as with Illustrator, there are additional options for the tab over on the right hand side. So in the case of swatches, I can choose to open a different set of swatches. Pantone is a color system that allows for different types of color palettes to be opened. You can reset, load, save swatches if you're creating a new set of colors. Swatches are for colors, they stand for colors. You can save a grouping of colors and in this right hand drop down dialog box, and you'll have a different set of options for each palette. So for example, under channels, I have different options for channels. So that's the basic kind of interface. All the drop down menus are the same. You'll have a series of tools that pop up here on the top depending on what option you have selected. So let's jump into this and look at what happens if we open a new file and what happens if we open an existing image. So under File and New, if I want to start building a new image out of multiple components, I would probably want to start either with one of the images as the background or with a new file as the background. And you can, if you have no experience with Photoshop, you can kind of think of it as a surface or a platform from which you can build images from multiple parts. So I can cut and paste from different images. I can take an existing image and adjust different things about it. I can scale things up and down, crop them. I can do a lot of different types of things to images. So if I wanted to start a new Photoshop file that's just a blank canvas that I can bring things into, I would want to go into the New option, so File, New, and then we have a similar tool, a dialog box. We have a similar dialog box as we did in Illustrator when we opened up a new file. So File, New, I can use one of the defaults that they have in here. So if I want it to be a photograph, I would typically say you're going to use custom. So preset custom, you can set the size of it if you want to have a 8.5 by 11 page that you're working on. You can type in the inches here. And the resolution is how much information per inch you're gonna have. So the higher resolution, the larger the file size, but also the better quality of image. The lower the resolution, the smaller file size, but the worse quality that you're gonna have. The rule of thumb is always the kind of best resolution possible for the most manageable size possible. So it's a balance between basic rules of thumb are 150 to 300 pixels per inch is a pretty good place to be working with. You do want to, though, relate that to the size of the image. So I could be working with a humongous resolution, a 600 pixel per inch resolution, but if it's not at the size of the final image that I'm going to be using, it's not going to matter. So you need to have both of these pretty accurately dialed in before you start working with an image. Otherwise, you're going to have to be careful about making adjustments down the line. Again, this will become a little bit more clear as we go through. Also, as with Illustrator, we have different color modes that we can work in. I'm going to assume that most documents that I'm going to be working with will eventually be printed, so I'm going to work in CMYK color space. 8 bits and 16 bits you don't really need to worry about now. We can talk about that more in class later. Lastly, the background contents can either be white, the color of the background color, which means the color behind here over in the tool palette. Unlike Illustrator, we don't have fill and stroke, we have foreground and background color that takes place down here, so the background color would be the background content, or you can have a transparent background. I'm going to make mine white for now. Lastly, you don't really need to worry about these advanced settings. You can look at the different color profile. This relates to the color profile of the information that gets sent out to things, so for printing and those sorts of things. Anyway, so I have kind of my basics set up here. I can adjust these, as I'm working with the image, but I want to get them pretty close to accurate to start. You can save these as a preset if you're going to be working on a bunch of different types of things that have the same parameters. You can save it as a preset, and then that would be in here to go in and grab. But for right now, I'm just going to start a new file. So here is my 8.5 by 11 horizontally oriented frame. I'm going to turn on my rulers, which is the shortcut for which is Command or Control R. You can also turn them on under View, Rulers, and you would just toggle it back and forth to be either checked or unchecked to be on or not. As with Illustrator, you can pull guides out of the rulers, and you can also change the location of those. So if I click on a guide and move it up and down, you can see that there's a number that pops up. So you should be able to go in and kind of fine-tune the location of these things. I'm going to get rid of my guides. So what I would want to do now is start bringing information into this image. You wouldn't necessarily in Photoshop start drawing something from scratch. If you're going to draw an image of something, you're probably going to start in Illustrator because you're mostly working with shapes in Photoshop in terms of what you can generate. So in Photoshop you have two different types, well, you have a couple different types of layers, but generally you have two different types of layers. One would either be a background where it's locked, or you have other layers that kind of sit on top of that. You can convert a layer into a background layer into a layer by right-clicking on it and choosing Layer from Background. I'm going to hit OK, and you can see now that the lock is gone, and I can double-click and type in something that names the layer. So I'm going to call this White Backgrounds. Okay, so we don't want to just be working with a white background. We want to start bringing information into this image. We can do this one of two ways, either by placing an image like we would in Illustrator, which brings it in as what's considered a smart layer, or we can open up another file and copy and paste information in. So I'm going to do the second. So I'm going to File, Open an existing image. I'm going to grab this image of just a general student model. You can see I now have two files open here. One is my white background and one is the IMG 0494 student model. I can take this image, I'm going to just decouple these so I can see both images at the same time, both files at the same time. I can take this whole image and grab it and drag it into my other kind of field here. And you can see now I have a white background and a layer 1. I can control the visibility, I can control the stack order, but more importantly I want to be able to edit different parts of each layer at one time. You want to make sure that the layer that you're working with is highlighted. So if I want to be doing something to layer 1 and not to layer into the white background, I want to make sure that's highlighted. What I want to do is, for instance, take out this light gray background and just have this model floating on top of the white background that I have here behind it. So I would need to select different parts of the image so that I'm working with just part rather than the whole image. There are three main types of selection that you can use in Photoshop. One of them are key tools, and again, if you press and hold down, you end up with, on icons that have this white triangle in the corner, you can see multiple options for them. So the standard is the rectangular marquee, and embedded within that are kind of elliptical or circular marquees, single row and single column. Below that you have the lasso tools. So you have a kind of freeform lasso, a polygonal lasso, and a magnetic lasso, and we'll look at what each of these does in a minute. And then lastly you have the magic wand tool or the quick selection tool. So let's see what each of these does. I'm going to start with the rectangular marquee, and I'm going to come over to my image and draw a box around the part that I want to be working with. And so once something is selected, you can see it has this kind of marching ants box that shows up around it so that you can see what part of the image you have selected. You can draw over the selection, so I didn't quite catch the top or the side of the shadow, so I can redraw that, or I can add to or subtract from the selection. So adding to would be holding down Shift, and I can add kind of a bump out to the image, or Option or Alt, depending on if you're a Mac or PC, will subtract from the selection. So Control D or Command D also allows for you to deselect everything. So I'm going to start that selection again by choosing the rectangular marquee, coming up here, making sure that I get most of the image, and then making some slight adjustments by holding down Shift so that I get kind of everything that I'm looking for. This, if we were to now start editing this part of the image, we could delete it, or we could, invert the selection. So under Select, Modify, Select Inverse, Control Shift or Command Shift I will select the outside rather than the inside, so I could hit delete and it would get rid of the outside that wasn't part of my inside my selection. I'm going to Command or Control D to deselect, and so we've gotten rid of part of the outside to the kind of the rectangular extents that we can around our image, but we really want to get rid of all of this in the exact shape that we want it. So let's add to this selection tool the kind of polygonal lasso, which allows for us to go in and draw the selection that we want. So we can basically draw a polygon over the image, the part of the image that we want to keep. So I'm just drawing around the outside of my model and shadow, and when I connect it back to itself, you can see now that there's marching ants along the outline of my shape. You can zoom in by using the magnifier tool, or the same shortcuts, the Command or Control minus and plus that worked in Illustrator also work in Photoshop. So if I didn't quite get the corner of this correctly, I can zoom out just a little bit and add to that selection using the marquee tool. So I'm going to hold down Shift. You can see that my icon for my cursor now has a little plus sign in the corner. And I'm going to start adding just this very edge that didn't quite get selected and connect back to it. Hold down Shift again. I didn't quite get this top edge. So I'm going to go in, grab this on the corner, and connect my selection back to the beginning so that I can get the whole thing in there. Command 0 scales out to full screen, and again, if I hit delete, you can see that I'm deleting the inside of this, which I don't want to do. Command Shift I inverts the selection, and I can delete the outside of it. Command D, and now I've got my model kind of sitting on a white backdrop. I could have also, rather than starting with one file and bringing another one into it, I could have just started editing in the original photograph image file. I'm just trying to show you a couple different steps for things. The last type of selection tool, let's say that this shadow looks a little dark for us. We want to adjust just the brightness of this shadow. The last type of selection tool would be the magic wand tool, or the shortcut for which is W. So when we have this selected, we can kind of click inside a field of color that we want to grab a lot of similar things to. What Photoshop does is it goes in and evaluates the tolerance between the point where you clicked and everything around it. So if I want to, be a little bit more generous with the types of gray that I'm using, I can go in and select multiple times and I'll be getting slightly different grays. Or I could go in, I'm going to deselect, and adjust the tolerance. So when we picked the magic wand tool, you can see up here in the kind of command bar that our options are changing. So in the, with Magic Wand, I have two or three things that I want to be careful of controlling. The first is the tolerance. So that's how much of a range it's going to allow. 32 is the default. A lot of times you'll be using a higher or lower tolerance than that. Because we didn't quite get all of the grays that we wanted, I'm going to up this to 40. And then also you can choose whether you want the selection to be contiguous or not. Contiguous means next to. So if I had, I had a little bit of red over here and a little bit of red over here and a little bit of red over here. If I chose contiguous, it would only select up to the edge of that red. It wouldn't jump over another color and come over and select another part. So if I uncheck that, it'll select all of the red anywhere on the drawing, regardless of if it's touching or not. So I'm going to keep my contiguous deselected. I've got my tolerance slightly higher than normal, and I'm going to click into the gray now. You can see the difference that happens this time, right? So there are little pieces of gray that are selected all over the image, which is not what we want. So I'm going to go back and reselect contiguous, deselect the gray, and click again. So we got quite a bit more this time. I'm going to hold down Shift and grab the edge of this, which now gives me everything that I want. Except I've picked up a little extra piece of the edge over here that I'm going to go in and deselect. So you can use different selection tools in combination to get the exact area of the image that you want. So I'm going to pick the polygonal lasso tool, hold down Option or Alt, and deselect this part over here by drawing a box around it. I'm also going to add to the selection this little piece of dust or something that was in the shadow, just so that I'm making the whole area lighter. When you're working with the polygonal lasso tool in particular, or with any selection in general, you want to be careful about the edge, right? We saw when we were selecting before that we didn't quite pick up everything. In this case, if we zoom in really closely, we can see that even though we were pretty close to what we wanted when we were looking at it from a higher level or a further out zoom, that when we zoom in pretty closely, our edge is not quite exactly what we want, or it's not quite exactly lined up. So I might want to, in this case over here on the right, use the deselect portion of the tool and go in and kind of straighten out that edge, which I can slowly kind of move over and down and grab all of this, or I can, while I'm in the middle of the command, I can Control minus and zoom out, or Command minus and zoom out. And I can get right to the very edge of this so that I have a straight line. And then I can do the same thing and add to the selection the bottom part of that, because it wasn't quite a straight line in either direction. So now I've got a very straight line along the edge. But I might want to further refine the edge by feathering it. So over here on the side, we talked a little bit about anti-aliasing when we were working with Illustrator, but as you can see here, we've got this edge that's a diagonal that's working within a square pixel format. So if I go into my selection, I can choose to refine the edge, and you can see here that now I'm looking at just the selected area, and I can start playing around with some of these toggles, right? So if I start feathering the edge, it's going to move it out slightly, or move it in slightly. I can shift the edge in or out, so I can choose to have more or less of the image in the frame. And when I hit, I'm not going to shift it that far, Smart Radius, I'm going to feather a little bit less, so you can see that the feathering is making it more or less fuzzy along the exterior, right? So it's going to soften that edge a bit, it's going to feather it. And I'm going to shift it so that it is getting the closest possible selection to what I'm looking for. So OK, brings me back out to where I was before. And now if I hit Control 0 or Command 0, I can zoom out to the entire image, and I can start doing something to the gray part of the drawing. So what I probably want to do is adjust the brightness or the contrast or the saturation of that. The brightness is how white it is, the darkness or the non-brightness is how black it is, and the contrast is how black and white or how gray it is. So under image, there's a couple ways to do this directly using some of the drop-down tools or through a series of adjustment layers, and we'll look at both of those. So image, adjustment, I'm going to start with brightness and contrast. So it brings up a dialog box, and if I bring the brightness up, you can see down here in my shadow that it's getting lighter, right? So lighter or darker, depending on which way I go in the brightness. Contrast is going to be a little bit tricky to see because our images, the part of the image that we're adjusting is gray, but we'll look at this again when we're working with more colorful things. So if I make my shadow a little bit lighter to the point that it looks good to me, I can hit OK, deselect my shadow, and now I've got something a little bit lighter on the page. If I, in my history palette, which if you don't have open is under Window in History, this shows me all of the different steps that I've done to the image since I opened it. So I can scroll back up and down. It keeps a certain number of steps, the certain number of the most recent ones, I think it's 20, but you can always go back to the original image when I go back to just my white background. I want to go back to deselect, just to show you, you can kind of go back one step at a time, refine your polygonal edge, go back to brightness, contrast, and then deselect it. So I want to go back to the point where I refine the edge. And instead of directly adjusting this, I want to go in and add an adjustment layer. So I need my adjustment dialog box open. So under Window, Adjustments, and they're down here at the bottom. I'm going to bring it up to the top here so that I can see it a little bit better. And in here, if you hover over these, in here, if you hover over each of these little icons, it'll show you what kind of adjustment it'll make. So I can choose to, in this case, use a brightness and contrast adjustment. And if I switch over to my layers, you can see that I now have not just my two content layers, but I also have this adjustment layer up here. Once I choose one of these adjustment layers, a dialog box pops, or a palette pops up that says Properties, which lets me adjust. It has the same type of adjustments that popped up when we did it just from the image adjustment layer, but now it's tied to that adjustment layer. And I'm going to pull my layers down here so I can see, both at one time. And because this is not happening directly on the layer, I can turn it off at any point and go back to the original image. This is called non-destructive editing, and it's really the way that you want to be working in Photoshop so that you can always go back to the original. If we count on our history to be able to do that, we can go back a certain number of steps, or we could go all the way back to the beginning, but we have a really hard time going back non-sequentially and making adjustments to things that we've done, or going back and changing our mind about something that we wanted. So it's best to be working with these adjustment layers. If I want to change something about the adjustment layer, I can do that in here. On the left-hand side is the content, so if I go in here and click on the little sun, it'll bring up my properties again. And if I click on the area to the right of it, this little black square with a kind of white bar through it, this is the mask of the layer. So this is the part that's telling me what it's looking at in the image. So if you imagine this as an icon that represents the size of my screen up here, this little white portion is showing me the area of the selection. So if I want to change something about what part of the image I'm looking at, I can go in and add to that. So with that adjustment layer selected and on the box that represents the kind of page, say I want to add this shadow inside my box to that. I'm going to use my polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to click in here. When with this selected, so things that are black are masked and things that are white are seeing through. So you can kind of see the representation of that here. So what I would need to do is either fill this, so edit, fill with white. I hit OK and you can see that my shadow just brightened up. Or I can delete it, which will delete it out of the background, and you can see over here in my icon that I now have two areas that are being adjusted. Or I can go in with some other tool like the brush tool and make my foreground color white and start brushing on the portion of the drawing that I want to be adjusting. So because these two areas are tied to each other within the same layer, I'm only going to be able to adjust them the same way, right? So maybe I would want to be able to adjust the inside of the model separately than the outside, in which case I would go in under the original layer. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to the point where I haven't made any adjustments to the layer. I'm going to go into the original and add a new adjustment layer for contrast. So that's here. So now I've got two different versions of that, and I can go up under brightness and contrast and start adjusting the area inside the square separately from the area outside the square. Okay, and so again, this is non-destructive editing, and it's an important one to get to. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to come back, and we're going to talk about a couple of other ways to work in Photoshop.